Chapter 1. Winning an argument is not about dominating another person or proving that you are intellectually superior. It is about influence, precision, and psychological control. Most people misunderstand arguments. They treat them as battles where the loudest voice or the fastest speaker wins. In reality, arguments are negotiations of perception. The person who can guide perception, manage emotions, and maintain composure is the one who wins consistently. The first and most critical principle is emotional regulation. When you lose control of your emotions, you lose control of the argument. Anger, frustration, and impatience are signals of weakness in a discussion. They indicate that you are reacting rather than thinking. The moment your emotions take over, your reasoning becomes less effective, and the other person gains leverage. People instinctively trust those who remain calm under pressure because calmness suggests confidence and authority. To build emotional discipline, you must develop awareness of your internal state. Notice when your heart rate increases, when your voice begins to rise, or when you feel the urge to interrupt. These are early warning signs. Instead of reacting immediately, pause. Silence can be more powerful than words. A brief pause before responding shows that you are in control and forces the other person to wait, which subtly shifts power in your favor. Another essential component is listening. Most people do not listen to understand. They listen to reply. This habit weakens their position because they miss critical details in the other person's argument. Effective listening allows you to identify gaps, inconsistencies, and emotional triggers. When you fully understand what the other person is saying, you can respond with precision rather than guesswork. Active listening involves more than just hearing words. It requires attention to tone, body language, and underlying intent. Often, what people say is not exactly what they mean. There may be fears, insecurities, or assumptions hidden beneath their statements. If you can identify these underlying factors, you gain a significant advantage. For example, someone arguing aggressively about a topic may actually be defending their ego rather than their logic. Addressing the ego rather than the surface argument can quickly de-escalate the situation. Validation is another powerful technique. This does not mean agreeing with the other person. It means acknowledging their perspective in a way that makes them feel heard. When people feel ignored or dismissed, they become defensive. When they feel understood, they become more open. A simple statement like, "I see why you would think that," can lower resistance significantly. Once resistance is lowered, you can begin to guide the conversation. Clarity is equally important. If your argument is unclear or overly complex, you lose effectiveness. Simplicity is strength. The best arguments are those that can be understood easily and remembered quickly. Avoid unnecessary jargon or long-winded explanations. Instead, focus on clear, concise points that directly address the issue. A single strong point is often more effective than multiple weak ones. Structure your argument logically. Begin with a clear claim, support it with evidence, and connect it back to the main issue. This creates a flow that is easy to follow. If your argument lacks structure, it becomes difficult for the other person to engage with it, and they may dismiss it entirely. Another key factor is timing. Knowing when to speak is just as important as knowing what to say. Interrupting someone weakens your position because it signals impatience and lack of control. Allow the other person to finish their point. This not only shows respect, but also gives you the opportunity to respond more effectively. When you speak at the right moment, your words carry more weight. Confidence plays a major role in persuasion. However, confidence must be balanced with humility. Overconfidence can make you appear arrogant, which creates resistance. On the other hand, a lack of confidence undermines your credibility. Aim for calm, steady confidence. Speak clearly, maintain a composed posture, and avoid unnecessary filler words. Your delivery should reflect certainty without aggression. Another powerful technique is controlling the pace of the conversation. If the discussion becomes too fast, it can lead to confusion and mistakes. Slow it down by asking questions, summarizing points, or pausing before responding. This gives you time to think and prevents the other person from overwhelming you with rapid arguments. Reframing is a strategic tool that allows you to shift the perspective of the conversation. Instead of directly opposing the other person, you take their point and present it in a different light. For example, if someone argues that a plan is risky, you can reframe it as an opportunity for calculated growth. This approach reduces conflict and makes your argument more acceptable. It is also important to recognize logical fallacies. Many arguments are based on flawed reasoning, such as overgeneralization, false assumptions, or emotional appeals. If you can identify these fallacies, you can address them effectively. However, do not simply label them. Instead, explain why the reasoning is flawed in a calm and respectful manner. Another aspect of winning arguments is knowing when not to argue. Not every disagreement needs to be resolved immediately. In some cases, walking away is the best strategy. This is not a sign of weakness. It is a sign of strategic thinking. If the other person is unwilling to listen or the situation is too emotionally charged, continuing the argument will only lead to frustration. Self-awareness is crucial in this process. You must be honest about your own biases and limitations. If you are wrong, acknowledge it. Admitting a mistake can actually strengthen your credibility because it shows integrity. People are more likely to trust someone who is honest about their errors than someone who refuses to admit them. Finally, practice is essential. Argumentation is a skill that improves with experience. Pay attention to your interactions, reflect on what worked and what did not, and continuously refine your approach. Over time, you will develop a natural ability to navigate arguments with confidence and precision. Winning every argument does not mean defeating every opponent. It means achieving your objective while maintaining respect and control. It means guiding conversations in a way that leads to understanding and resolution. When you master emotional discipline, active listening, clarity, and strategic thinking, you position yourself to succeed in any argument. Chapter 2. Mastering arguments requires more than emotional control and listening skills. It demands a deep understanding of language, persuasion, and human psychology. Words are not just tools for communication, they are instruments of influence. The way you choose and arrange your words can determine the outcome of an argument before it even fully develops. One of the most powerful techniques in argumentation is framing. Framing is the process of presenting information in a way that influences how it is perceived. Two people can present the same facts in different ways and achieve completely different reactions. The key is to frame your argument in a way that aligns with the values and concerns of the other person. For example, if you are discussing a decision that involves risk, framing it as a potential loss will create fear, while framing it as a potential gain will create excitement. Understanding this allows you to guide the emotional direction of the conversation. Always consider how your words will be interpreted, not just what they literally mean. Another critical technique is the use of questions. Questions are less confrontational than statements and more effective at guiding thought. When you ask a question, you invite the other person to participate in the reasoning process. This reduces resistance and increases engagement. Instead of telling someone they are wrong, ask questions that lead them to reconsider their position. Effective questions are specific and purposeful. Avoid vague or rhetorical questions that do not add value. Instead, focus on questions that expose assumptions or require clarification. For instance, what evidence supports that conclusion? Or, how does this approach address the main issue? These questions encourage critical thinking and often reveal weaknesses in the argument. Another important concept is the burden of proof. In any argument, the person making a claim is responsible for supporting it. Do not take on the burden of disproving every point the other person makes. Instead, shift the responsibility back to them by asking for evidence and clarification. This not only strengthens your position, but also prevents you from being overwhelmed. Language precision is essential. Avoid exaggerations and absolute terms because they are easy to challenge. Statements like "this always happens" or "this never works" can be quickly disproven with a single counterexample. Instead, use measured language that reflects accuracy. This makes your argument more resilient and credible. Tone is another critical factor. The same words can have different effects depending on how they are delivered. A calm and steady tone conveys confidence, while a harsh or sarcastic tone creates resistance. Be mindful of your tone, especially in high-stakes discussions. Your goal is to maintain a constructive atmosphere, even when the topic is contentious. Persuasion also involves understanding cognitive biases. People do not always think rationally. They are influenced by biases such as confirmation bias, where they favor information that supports their existing beliefs, and anchoring, where they rely heavily on the first piece of information they receive. By recognizing these biases, you can adjust your approach accordingly. For example, if someone is strongly attached to a belief, presenting contradictory evidence directly may not be effective. Instead, introduce new information gradually and connect it to their existing perspective. This reduces resistance and increases the likelihood of acceptance. Another powerful strategy is storytelling. Facts and data are important, but stories are more memorable and emotionally engaging. A well-placed example or narrative can make your argument more relatable and impactful. When people can visualize a situation, they are more likely to understand and accept your point. However, storytelling should be used carefully. Ensure that your examples are relevant and accurate. Irrelevant or exaggerated stories can weaken your credibility. The goal is to enhance your argument, not distract from it. Strategic concession is another technique that can strengthen your position. This involves acknowledging valid points in the other person's argument. By doing so, you demonstrate fairness and open-mindedness. This reduces defensiveness and makes the other person more receptive to your perspective. A statement like, "You are right about this aspect, but here is where I see it differently," creates a balanced and persuasive argument. Control of focus is also important. In many arguments, discussions can drift away from the main issue. This can lead to confusion and wasted time. Keep the conversation focused on the key point. If the other person introduces unrelated topics, gently steer the discussion back. This ensures that your argument remains clear and effective. Another aspect of winning arguments is recognizing when the other person is using emotional manipulation. This can include tactics such as guilt, intimidation, or exaggeration. Do not respond emotionally to these tactics. Instead, address them calmly and bring the conversation back to logic and evidence. Confidence in your knowledge is essential, but it must be supported by preparation. Before engaging in important arguments, ensure that you understand the topic thoroughly, anticipate potential counterarguments, and prepare responses. This allows you to respond quickly and effectively during the discussion. It is also important to adapt your approach based on the context. Different situations require different strategies. A professional discussion may require a formal and structured approach, while a personal conversation may require empathy and flexibility. Being adaptable increases your effectiveness across different scenarios. Finally, remember that the goal of an argument is not always to achieve immediate agreement. In many cases, the goal is to influence future thinking. Even if the other person does not change their mind during the conversation, your arguments may have a lasting impact. Planting a seed of doubt or introducing a new perspective can lead to change over time. Winning every argument is not about being aggressive or confrontational. It is about being strategic, thoughtful, and composed. It is about understanding human behavior and using that understanding to guide conversations effectively. When you master language, persuasion, and psychological insight, you gain the ability to influence outcomes consistently. With practice and awareness, these techniques become second nature. You will find yourself navigating arguments with ease, maintaining control even in challenging situations, and achieving your objectives with precision. This is the true meaning of winning every argument. Chapter 3. At an advanced level, winning arguments is less about what you say and more about how you control the entire interaction. This includes controlling direction, energy, structure, and even the psychological environment of the conversation. Most people focus only on content, but experts focus on dynamics. If you understand and control the dynamics, the content becomes significantly more effective. The first concept to master in this stage is conversational control. Every argument has a direction. Either you are directing it or the other person is. If you allow the conversation to drift wherever the other person takes it, you lose strategic positioning. Skilled communicators subtly guide discussions toward areas where they are strongest and away from areas where they are vulnerable. You can control direction by setting boundaries early. Define what the argument is actually about. Many arguments fail because the topic constantly shifts. For example, what begins as a discussion about performance turns into a debate about personality or past mistakes. This weakens clarity and creates emotional noise. If this happens, calmly bring the discussion back by saying, "Let's stay focused on the main point." This simple intervention reestablishes structure. Another important element is controlling definitions. Many arguments are actually disagreements about definitions rather than facts. If two people are using the same word but meaning different things, confusion is inevitable. Clarify key terms early in the discussion. Ask, "What do you mean by this?" or define your own terms clearly. Once definitions are aligned, the argument becomes more precise and easier to manage. Control of assumptions is equally critical. Every argument is built on underlying assumptions. These assumptions are often unspoken, yet they determine the strength of the argument. If you can identify and challenge incorrect assumptions, you can weaken the entire structure of the opposing argument. For example, if someone assumes that a certain approach always leads to failure, question that assumption directly. Ask for evidence or examples. Often, you will find that the assumption is based on limited or biased experience. Another advanced technique is layering your argument. Instead of presenting all your points at once, build your case step by step. Start with simple, agreeable points that establish common ground. Once agreement is established, gradually introduce more complex or challenging ideas. This reduces resistance because the other person is already aligned with your earlier points. Pacing is critical in this process. Do not rush to your strongest argument immediately. Allow the conversation to develop. Give the other person time to process each point. This creates a rhythm that keeps the discussion controlled and deliberate. If you move too quickly, you risk overwhelming the other person, which can lead to rejection of your ideas. Another powerful concept is psychological anchoring. The first strong idea presented in an argument often sets the reference point for everything that follows. If you can establish a strong initial position, it becomes easier to guide the rest of the discussion. This is why opening statements are so important. Begin with a clear, confident, and reasonable position that frames the conversation in your favor. However, anchoring must be done carefully. If your initial position is too extreme, it can backfire and create resistance. Aim for a position that is strong but reasonable. This creates a foundation that is difficult to challenge. Handling objections is another critical skill. Most people react defensively when their ideas are challenged. This weakens their position. Instead, treat objections as opportunities. Each objection reveals what the other person is thinking and where their resistance lies. Address objections calmly and directly. Do not avoid them or dismiss them. When you handle objections effectively, you strengthen your credibility and reinforce your argument. A useful technique here is to acknowledge, respond, and redirect. First, acknowledge the objection to show that you understand it. Second, respond with logic or evidence. Third, redirect the conversation back to your main point. This keeps the discussion structured and prevents it from derailing. Another advanced strategy is contrast. People understand ideas better when they are compared to alternatives. Instead of presenting your argument in isolation, compare it with other options. Highlight the strengths of your approach and the weaknesses of the alternatives. This creates clarity and makes your position more compelling. Control of energy is also important. Every conversation has an emotional tone. If the energy becomes too high, the discussion can turn into conflict. If it becomes too low, the discussion loses momentum. Aim for a balanced energy level that is calm but engaged. Adjust your tone, pace, and body language to maintain this balance. Nonverbal communication plays a significant role here. Your posture, eye contact, and facial expressions all influence how your message is received. Maintain an open and relaxed posture. Avoid aggressive gestures or closed body language. Consistent eye contact shows confidence and attentiveness. These nonverbal signals reinforce your verbal message. Another key element is strategic silence. Silence is often underestimated, but it can be one of the most powerful tools in an argument. After making a strong point, pause. Allow the other person to process what you have said. Silence creates pressure and encourages the other person to respond. It also gives you time to think and maintain control. Repetition is another useful technique when used correctly. Important points should be reinforced, but not in a repetitive or obvious way. Restate your key ideas in different forms throughout the conversation. This ensures that your message is remembered without sounding redundant. It is also essential to recognize patterns in arguments. Over time, you will notice that many arguments follow similar structures. People often rely on familiar reasoning patterns, even if those patterns are flawed. By recognizing these patterns, you can anticipate their arguments and prepare effective responses. Another advanced skill is emotional detachment. This does not mean being indifferent. It means maintaining a clear separation between your identity and your ideas. If you take every disagreement personally, you become defensive and less effective. Treat arguments as intellectual exercises rather than personal battles. This allows you to think more clearly and respond more strategically. Building credibility is also crucial. People are more likely to accept arguments from individuals they trust. Credibility is built through consistency, honesty, and competence. Do not exaggerate your knowledge or make claims you cannot support. If you are unsure about something, admit it. This strengthens your integrity and makes your arguments more persuasive. Another important concept is timing your conclusion. Many people either end arguments too early or prolong them unnecessarily. Learn to recognize when the key points have been established. Once your argument is clear and the other person has had the opportunity to respond, move toward a conclusion. Summarize your main points and reinforce your position. A strong conclusion leaves a lasting impression. Adaptability is essential throughout this process. No two arguments are exactly the same. Different people require different approaches. Some respond to logic, others to emotion, and others to authority. Observe the other person's communication style and adjust your approach accordingly. This flexibility increases your effectiveness in a wide range of situations. Another advanced technique is preemptive argumentation. Anticipate potential objections before they are raised and address them proactively. This demonstrates preparation and reduces the impact of counterarguments. For example, you can say, "You might be thinking that this approach has certain risks, and that is true, but here is how those risks can be managed." This shows that you have considered multiple perspectives. It is also important to maintain ethical standards. Winning arguments through manipulation or deception may provide short-term success, but it damages trust and credibility in the long term. Focus on honest and constructive communication. The goal is not just to win, but to build understanding and maintain respect. Finally, reflection is essential for continuous improvement. After each significant argument, take time to analyze your performance. Identify what worked well and what could be improved. This process of reflection allows you to refine your skills and become more effective over time. At this level, argumentation becomes a strategic discipline. It is no longer about reacting in the moment, but about planning, controlling, and executing with precision. You are not just participating in conversations, you are shaping them. You are not just responding to arguments, you are designing them. When you master conversational control, structure, psychological insight, and adaptability, you reach a level where arguments are no longer stressful or unpredictable. They become opportunities to demonstrate clarity, influence, and intellectual strength. This is where true mastery begins. Chapter 4. At the highest level, winning arguments evolves into something more refined than strategy alone. It becomes the art of influence without resistance. At this stage, the objective is no longer to win, in the traditional sense, but to guide the other person to a point where agreement feels natural, even self-directed. This is where advanced psychological insight, restraint, and precision converge. The first concept to understand is that direct confrontation often creates invisible barriers. The more directly you push against someone's belief, the more firmly they hold onto it. This is known as psychological reactance. When people feel their autonomy is threatened, they resist, even if your argument is correct. Therefore, instead of pushing, you must learn to guide. Guidance begins with alignment. Before introducing disagreement, establish areas of agreement. This reduces tension and creates a cooperative environment. Even in strong disagreements, there are always small points of overlap. Identify them and acknowledge them clearly. This signals that you are not an adversary, but a collaborator seeking clarity. Once alignment is established, introduce your perspective gradually. Avoid abrupt contradictions. Instead of saying, "You are wrong," say, "There is another way to look at this." This subtle shift reduces resistance and keeps the conversation open. The goal is to expand their thinking, not shut it down. Another critical principle is managing ego. In many arguments, the real issue is not logic, but identity. People attach their beliefs to their sense of self. Challenging the belief feels like challenging the person. If you attack their identity, they will defend it at all costs. To avoid this, separate the person from the idea. Focus your critique on the idea, not the individual. For example, instead of saying, "You don't understand this," say, "This part might need a closer look." This keeps the conversation constructive and avoids personal conflict. Respect preserves influence. Disrespect destroys it instantly. Another advanced technique is controlled vulnerability. Admitting uncertainty or acknowledging past mistakes can increase your credibility. It shows that you are not driven by ego, but by truth. This lowers the other person's defenses and encourages openness. However, this must be done strategically. Do not undermine your position, but demonstrate that you are willing to consider multiple perspectives. Narrative framing becomes even more powerful at this level. Humans think in stories, not just facts. If you can embed your argument within a compelling narrative, it becomes easier to accept. Instead of presenting isolated data points, connect them into a logical and relatable sequence. Show cause and effect. Show consequences. Help the other person visualize the outcome of different choices. Another important element is pacing emotional shifts. Sudden changes in tone or intensity can disrupt the flow of the conversation. Instead, guide the emotional progression gradually. If the conversation starts calmly, maintain that tone. If it becomes tense, do not escalate further. Lower your tone, slow your pace, and bring the discussion back to a stable level. Precision in language becomes critical here. At this level, even small wording choices can change outcomes. Avoid ambiguous or loaded language. Choose words that are neutral, clear, and intentional. Replace emotionally charged terms with descriptive ones. This keeps the focus on the issue rather than triggering emotional reactions. Silence, once again, plays a crucial role, but in a more refined way. Strategic silence can be used not only after making a point, but also before responding to a challenging statement. This creates space for reflection and prevents impulsive reactions. It also signals that you are considering the discussion carefully, which enhances your credibility. Another advanced concept is perspective shifting. Instead of forcing the other person to adopt your viewpoint, temporarily adopt theirs. Argue from their perspective. Show them that you understand their reasoning deeply. Then, gradually introduce limitations or alternative interpretations within that framework. This approach reduces resistance because it feels less like opposition and more like refinement. Control of narrative direction is also essential. Every argument tells a story. Either the story supports your position or it supports theirs. Guide the narrative toward outcomes that reinforce your argument. Highlight consequences, risks, and benefits in a way that aligns with your objective. If the narrative drifts, gently bring it back. Another critical skill is recognizing when the argument has already been won, even if it is not explicitly acknowledged. Sometimes, the other person may not verbally agree, but their tone, questions, or body language indicate a shift in thinking. At this point, pushing further can create unnecessary resistance. Instead, allow the conversation to conclude naturally. A forced victory can turn into a loss. Strategic patience is essential. Not all arguments are resolved immediately. In many cases, influence occurs over time. What you say today may not change someone's mind instantly, but it can shape their thinking in the long term. Accept this process. Focus on planting clear, logical, and memorable ideas rather than forcing immediate agreement. Another high-level technique is managing group dynamics. Arguments in a group setting are fundamentally different from one-on-one discussions. In groups, perception matters even more. You are not just influencing one person, but an audience. Maintain composure, avoid direct confrontation, and present your ideas clearly and confidently. Often, Winning the audience is more important than winning the individual. Authority and credibility also play a significant role at this level. People are more likely to accept arguments from those they perceive as knowledgeable and reliable. Build this perception through consistency, preparation, and clarity. Avoid exaggeration or overstatement. Let your reasoning and delivery establish your authority naturally. Another important factor is cognitive load. Overloading the other person with too much information can weaken your argument. Even strong points can lose impact if they are buried in excessive detail. Prioritize your most important ideas. Deliver them clearly and allow space for them to be processed. Advanced argumentation also involves recognizing manipulation tactics used by others. These can include shifting topics, emotional appeals, false dilemmas, or attempts to provoke a reaction. Do not engage with these tactics directly. Instead, calmly redirect the conversation to the main issue. Maintain your structure and do not allow the discussion to become chaotic. Ethical awareness becomes even more important at this level. With advanced skills comes greater responsibility. The ability to influence others should not be used to mislead or exploit. Focus on truth, clarity, and constructive outcomes. Long-term credibility and respect are far more valuable than short-term victories. Another critical concept is internal alignment. Your words, tone, and body language must be consistent. If there is a mismatch, it creates doubt. For example, confident words delivered with hesitation reduce credibility. Ensure that your communication is aligned at all levels. This creates a strong and coherent presence. Closing an argument at this level requires subtlety. Instead of declaring victory, summarize the key points and emphasize shared understanding. Leave the door open for further discussion if needed. This maintains a positive dynamic and preserves relationships. Reflection and refinement remain essential. Even at an advanced level, there is always room for improvement. Analyze your interactions, identify patterns, and refine your approach. Mastery is a continuous process. Ultimately, winning every argument at this level is not about dominance. It is about influence without friction. It is about guiding conversations with precision, maintaining respect, and achieving clarity. When you reach this stage, arguments no longer feel like conflicts. They become opportunities to shape understanding, build trust, and create meaningful outcomes. This is the highest form of argumentation. Not loud, not aggressive, but controlled, thoughtful, and effective. When practiced consistently, it transforms the way you communicate, negotiate, and influence the world around you. Chapter 5. At the final stage of mastery, argumentation becomes a system rather than a set of techniques. You are no longer reacting, adjusting, or even strategically planning in isolated moments. Instead, you operate with an internal framework that allows you to navigate any argument with consistency, clarity, and control. This system integrates everything you have learned: emotional discipline, structure, psychological awareness, language precision, and strategic timing into a seamless process. The first component of this system is anticipation. Before an argument even begins, you should already have a mental map of how it might unfold. This does not mean predicting exact words, but understanding patterns. Most arguments follow predictable structures. There is an opening claim, a defense, a counter, and an escalation or resolution. When you recognize this structure, you are no longer surprised by the direction of the conversation. You are prepared. Preparation is not limited to knowledge of the topic. It includes understanding the person you are engaging with. What are their values? What motivates them? What are their communication habits? Some individuals respond to logic and data, while others respond to emotion and narrative. Some prefer direct communication, while others require a softer approach. Adapting to these preferences increases your effectiveness significantly. Another key element is strategic positioning. Enter every argument with a clear objective. Ask yourself, what is the desired outcome? Is it to persuade, to clarify, to negotiate, or simply to understand? Without a defined objective, the argument becomes directionless. Once your objective is clear, align your approach accordingly. Every statement, question, and response should move the conversation closer to that objective. Control of entry is also critical. How you begin an argument often determines how it will proceed. A strong opening establishes tone, direction, and credibility. Avoid starting with confrontation. Instead, begin with clarity and neutrality. Present your perspective in a way that invites discussion rather than resistance. A well-structured opening reduces the likelihood of escalation. Another advanced principle is economy of words. At this level, efficiency becomes a priority. Say only what is necessary, but ensure that it is precise and impactful. Over-explaining weakens your position and creates opportunities for misinterpretation. Strong communicators use fewer words, but each word carries weight. This creates authority and keeps the conversation focused. Layered communication is another essential technique. This involves delivering your message on multiple levels simultaneously. There is the surface level, which is the literal meaning of your words. Then, there is the implied level, which conveys intention and perspective. Finally, there is the relational level, which influences how the other person feels during the interaction. Mastering all three levels ensures that your message is both understood and accepted. Another critical component is resilience under pressure. In high-stakes arguments, the other person may attempt to destabilize you through aggression, interruption, or emotional provocation. Your ability to remain composed in these moments is a defining factor. Do not mirror their intensity. Instead, maintain your structure and respond with calm precision. This contrast often shifts the dynamic in your favor. A powerful strategy at this level is controlled redirection. When the conversation moves into unproductive territory, do not engage directly. Instead, acknowledge the point briefly and redirect to the main issue. For example, that may be relevant, but the core issue here is. This keeps the discussion aligned with your objective without creating unnecessary conflict. Another advanced skill is compression. This involves summarizing complex arguments into simple, clear statements. The ability to distill information into its essence is a mark of mastery. It not only makes your argument more accessible, but also more memorable. People are more likely to retain and repeat concise ideas. Timing remains a central factor. Knowing when to speak, when to pause, and when to conclude requires awareness and experience. Do not rush to fill silence. Allow moments of pause to work in your favor. At the same time, recognize when the conversation has reached its natural endpoint. Extending an argument beyond its useful limit can reduce its impact. Another important concept is influence without visibility. At this level, the most effective arguments often feel like they were not arguments at all. The other person arrives at the conclusion with minimal resistance. This is achieved through subtle guidance, strategic questioning, and careful framing. When done correctly, the influence is internalized rather than imposed. Handling difficult personalities is also part of this mastery. Some individuals are consistently defensive, aggressive, or dismissive. In such cases, traditional argumentation may not be effective. Instead, focus on maintaining your own structure and boundaries. Do not attempt to force agreement. Sometimes, the best outcome is to prevent escalation and preserve your position. Another high-level principle is detachment from outcome. While having a clear objective is important, becoming overly attached to winning can reduce your effectiveness. It creates pressure and may lead to forced or unnatural communication. Maintain focus on the process rather than the immediate result. When you execute the process correctly, outcomes improve naturally. Ethical consistency must remain central. With advanced influence comes the ability to shape decisions significantly. Use this responsibly. Avoid manipulation that distorts truth or exploits vulnerability. Long-term trust, credibility, and professional integrity are built on ethical communication. Another essential component is adaptability across contexts. Arguments occur in various environments: professional settings, academic discussions, personal relationships, and public forums. Each context requires a different balance of formality, empathy, and assertiveness. Adjust your approach accordingly while maintaining your core principles. Self-calibration is also crucial. Continuously monitor your own performance during the argument. Are you staying aligned with your objective? Are you maintaining clarity and composure? If you notice deviation, adjust immediately. This real-time awareness allows you to stay in control even as the conversation evolves. Another advanced technique is strategic closure. Ending an argument effectively is just as important as starting it. Summarize key points, reinforce your position, and leave a clear impression. Avoid abrupt endings or unnecessary prolongation. A well-executed conclusion ensures that your message remains intact after the conversation ends. Long-term influence is the final layer of mastery. Winning a single argument is useful, but shaping how people think over time is far more powerful. This requires consistency, credibility, and repeated exposure to clear reasoning. Over time, people begin to trust your perspective even before the argument begins. Reflection completes the system. After each meaningful interaction, evaluate your performance. Identify strengths, weaknesses, and areas for improvement. This continuous refinement ensures that your skills evolve rather than stagnate. At this level, argumentation is no longer situational. It becomes part of your thinking process. You approach discussions with clarity, respond with precision, and maintain control without effort. Arguments no longer feel like conflicts to be won, but systems to be managed. This is the final stage. Not loud, not forceful, not reactive. It is structured, controlled, and intentional. When you reach this point, you do not just win arguments, you define them. You shape their direction, influence their outcome, and leave a lasting impact on how others think and respond. This is true mastery. Chapter 5. At the final stage of mastery, argumentation becomes less visible and more systemic. You are no longer just responding within conversations, you are designing them before they even begin. This is the level where preparation, anticipation, and strategic positioning determine outcomes long before words are exchanged. Winning every argument at this level is not about reacting better in the moment, but about entering the conversation already aligned for success. The first concept to understand is pre-framing. Every argument begins before the first sentence is spoken. People enter discussions with expectations, biases, and emotional states. If you can influence these factors early, you gain a decisive advantage. This can be done through context setting, tone, and initial positioning. The way you introduce a topic shapes how it will be received. For example, if you begin with tension or urgency, the conversation becomes defensive. If you begin with clarity and purpose, it becomes constructive. A simple opening like, "I want to understand this clearly," so we can reach the best outcome, establishes a cooperative frame. This reduces resistance before any disagreement is introduced. Another critical element is anticipation. At this level, you should rarely be surprised by counterarguments. Before entering an important discussion, map out possible responses from the other person. Identify their likely objections, emotional triggers, and reasoning patterns. Then prepare structured responses in advance. This allows you to respond with precision rather than improvisation. Anticipation also involves understanding the other person's incentives. People argue based on what they value, fear, or stand to gain or lose. If you can identify these drivers, you can align your argument with them. For instance, if someone values stability, emphasize how your position reduces risk. If they value growth, highlight opportunity and long-term benefits. Alignment reduces resistance significantly. Another advanced principle is leverage. In any argument, certain points carry more weight than others. These are leverage points. Instead of spreading your effort across multiple weaker arguments, focus on the few points that have the highest impact. A single strong argument, delivered effectively, can outweigh several weaker ones. Leverage also comes from credibility, evidence, and timing. Present your strongest evidence at the right moment, not all at once. Build momentum first, then introduce high-impact points when they will have the greatest effect. This creates a structured progression that is difficult to counter. Another key aspect is strategic positioning. Where you stand in an argument matters. If you position yourself as rigid or extreme, you limit your flexibility. If you position yourself as reasonable and open, you gain room to maneuver. Always aim to occupy the most defensible and adaptable position. This allows you to adjust your approach without losing credibility. Control of narrative becomes even more refined at this level. You are not just responding to arguments. You are shaping the storyline that defines them. Every argument has a beginning, middle, and end. Guide this progression intentionally. Establish context, build tension through key points, and resolve with clarity. Another important concept is cognitive economy. People prefer simple, clear ideas over complex ones. Even highly intelligent individuals are influenced by simplicity. If your argument is too complex, it becomes difficult to process and easy to reject. Reduce complexity without losing accuracy. Distill your ideas into their most essential form. Reinforcement is also critical. Important ideas should be repeated strategically throughout the conversation, but in varied forms. This strengthens retention and ensures that your key points are not overlooked. However, avoid obvious repetition. Subtle variation maintains engagement while reinforcing the message. Another advanced technique is contrast framing. Present your argument alongside a less desirable alternative. This creates a clear comparison that highlights the strengths of your position. For example, instead of simply stating that your approach is effective, show how alternative approaches fail or create additional problems. This makes your argument more compelling. Timing is a decisive factor at this level. Knowing when to speak, when to pause, and when to conclude determines the effectiveness of your argument. Interrupting at the wrong moment or extending the discussion unnecessarily can weaken your position. Develop sensitivity to the flow of the conversation and adjust accordingly. Another critical skill is resilience under pressure. High-stakes arguments often involve stress, interruptions, or aggressive tactics. At this level, you must remain composed regardless of external pressure. Do not mirror aggression. Maintain your structure, tone, and clarity. This stability creates contrast and reinforces your authority. Handling difficult personalities is also essential. Some individuals argue emotionally, others defensively, and others manipulatively. Each requires a different approach. Emotional individuals need acknowledgement and calmness. Defensive individuals need reassurance and clarity. Manipulative individuals require firm boundaries and structured responses. Adaptability ensures that you remain effective across different personalities. Another important principle is strategic concession. Conceding minor points can strengthen your overall position. It demonstrates fairness and reduces resistance. However, concessions must be controlled. Do not concede core elements of your argument. Focus on areas that do not weaken your main position, but increase your credibility. At this level, persuasion often happens indirectly. Instead of pushing for agreement, you create conditions where agreement becomes the most logical choice. This can be achieved through structured reasoning, clear comparisons, and consistent framing. The other person begins to see your position as the natural conclusion rather than an imposed idea. Another advanced concept is memory anchoring. People do not remember entire conversations. They remember key moments. Identify these moments and deliver your strongest points with clarity and emphasis. A well-timed, well-phrased statement can define the entire outcome of the argument. You must also develop awareness of diminishing returns. Beyond a certain point, continuing an argument adds little value and can even reverse progress. Recognize when your message has been delivered effectively. At that point, reduce intensity and move toward closure. Closure at this level is subtle and controlled. Summarize the key points, reinforce alignment, and leave the conversation on a constructive note. Avoid aggressive conclusions or declarations of victory. The goal is to maintain influence beyond the conversation itself. Long-term influence is the ultimate objective. Winning a single argument is less important than shaping ongoing perception. Consistency, credibility, and clarity over time build a reputation that strengthens all future arguments. People begin to trust your reasoning before you even present it. Reflection remains essential. Analyze your performance after important discussions. Identify strengths, weaknesses, and patterns. Continuous refinement is what sustains mastery. Even at the highest level, there is always room to improve. Finally, understand that true mastery of argumentation is not about control over others, but control over yourself. Your ability to regulate emotions, think clearly, communicate precisely, and adapt strategically determines your success. External outcomes are influenced by internal discipline. When you reach this stage, arguments are no longer confrontations. They become structured exchanges where you guide direction, manage perception, and achieve outcomes with consistency. You do not rely on force or dominance. You rely on clarity, preparation, and precision. This is the final level of winning every argument. Not through noise, not through aggression, but through quiet control, strategic thinking, and disciplined execution. When practiced consistently, it transforms not only how you argue, but how you think, communicate, and influence in every area of life. Chapter 6. Beyond mastery lies refinement, and refinement is what separates consistent success from situational success. At this stage, argumentation is no longer a skill you consciously apply. It becomes an integrated way of thinking. You do not enter arguments. You navigate conversations with such clarity and control that disagreement rarely escalates into conflict. This is where subtlety, timing, and psychological awareness operate almost invisibly. The first concept at this level is invisible influence. The strongest arguments are often the ones that do not feel like arguments at all. Instead of engaging in direct opposition, you guide the conversation in a way that leads the other person to your conclusion naturally. This requires restraint. The urge to correct, to interrupt, or to prove must be controlled. The moment you make the conversation feel like a contest, resistance increases. To apply invisible influence, begin by asking yourself a simple question. What outcome do I want from this conversation? Not what point you want to prove, but what result you want to achieve. Once the outcome is clear, shape your communication accordingly. Every statement, every question, and every pause should serve that objective. Another critical principle is cognitive alignment. People are more receptive to ideas that feel consistent with their existing beliefs. Instead of presenting your argument as something entirely new, connect it to what they already accept. Build bridges between their perspective and yours. This reduces friction and makes your argument easier to accept. For example, if someone values efficiency, frame your argument in terms of saving time or resources. If they value fairness, emphasize balance and equity. Alignment is not manipulation. It is strategic communication. You are presenting truth in a form that resonates with the listener. Another advanced concept is tension management. Every argument contains a certain level of tension. Too little tension leads to disengagement, while too much leads to conflict. Your role is to maintain optimal tension. This means introducing challenge without triggering defensiveness. You can manage tension through tone, pacing, and structure. If the conversation becomes too intense, slow it down. Lower your voice slightly, pause more often, and simplify your statements. If the conversation becomes too passive, introduce sharper questions or more direct points. This dynamic adjustment keeps the interaction balanced. Another essential skill is precision questioning. At this level, your questions are not just tools for clarification, they are instruments for guidance. Each question should move the conversation closer to your objective. Avoid random or reactive questions. Instead, design them with intent. For instance, instead of asking broad questions like, "What do you think?" ask targeted questions such as, "What would be the most effective way to achieve this outcome?" This narrows the focus and directs the other person's thinking toward productive pathways. Silence evolves into a more strategic tool here. It is not just about pausing after a statement, but about creating space throughout the conversation. Silence allows ideas to settle, reduces emotional intensity, and gives you time to observe. Many people feel uncomfortable with silence and will fill it by revealing more information. This can provide valuable insight into their position. Another key principle is pattern recognition at a deeper level. By now, you should be able to identify not just logical patterns, but behavioral ones. Notice how certain individuals respond under pressure, how they structure their arguments, and where they tend to make errors. These patterns allow you to anticipate responses with high accuracy. Another advanced technique is reframing at multiple levels. Earlier, reframing involved shifting perspective within the argument. At this level, you can reframe the entire context of the discussion. For example, instead of debating whether a specific decision is right or wrong, you can shift the conversation to broader criteria such as long-term impact or underlying principles. This changes the structure of the argument itself. Another important concept is maintaining neutrality in expression. Even when you strongly disagree, your external behavior should remain balanced. This does not mean suppressing your position, but expressing it without emotional volatility. Neutrality creates stability, and stability increases trust. You must also understand the role of perception in authority. Authority is not just about knowledge, it is about how that knowledge is perceived. Clear articulation, steady tone, and structured reasoning all contribute to perceived authority. When people perceive you as composed and precise, they are more likely to accept your arguments. Another advanced element is strategic ambiguity. While clarity is generally important, there are moments where controlled ambiguity can be useful. This allows flexibility and prevents unnecessary conflict. For example, instead of committing to a rigid position immediately, you can leave space for adjustment as the conversation develops. However, this must be used carefully. Too much ambiguity can reduce credibility. Adaptation becomes almost automatic at this stage. You adjust your communication style based on subtle cues such as tone, body language, and response patterns. If someone becomes defensive, you soften your approach. If they become disengaged, you increase clarity and directness. This continuous adjustment maintains effectiveness. Another critical principle is emotional intelligence. Understanding not just what people say, but what they feel, gives you a significant advantage. Emotions often drive arguments more than logic. If you can identify and address emotional undercurrents, you can resolve conflicts more effectively. For example, if someone is frustrated, addressing the frustration directly can be more effective than continuing with logical arguments. A statement like, "It seems this situation has been frustrating," can reduce tension and create openness. Another advanced skill is layered communication. This involves delivering messages that operate on multiple levels simultaneously. A single statement can acknowledge the other person's perspective, present your argument, and guide the conversation forward. This efficiency increases impact without increasing complexity. You must also refine your ability to disengage strategically. Not every argument needs to be pursued to completion. Recognize when the cost of continuing outweighs the benefit. Disengaging at the right moment preserves your energy and maintains your composure. Another concept at this level is consistency over time. Your effectiveness in arguments is not determined by a single interaction, but by patterns of behavior. Consistent clarity, respect, and precision build a reputation that strengthens your influence in future discussions. You should also develop awareness of long-term dynamics. Some arguments are part of ongoing relationships or recurring situations. In these cases, your approach should consider future interactions. Focus on building understanding and maintaining respect rather than achieving immediate victory. Another advanced principle is internal calibration. Continuously assess your own performance during the conversation. Adjust your tone, pacing, and structure in real time. This self-monitoring ensures that you remain aligned with your objective. Finally, understand that at this level, argumentation becomes less about technique and more about mindset. You approach discussions with clarity, patience, and control. You are not driven by the need to win, but by the intention to achieve meaningful outcomes. When you reach this stage, arguments lose their intensity. They become structured, calm, and productive exchanges. You guide conversations without forcing them. You influence without creating resistance. You maintain control without appearing controlling. This is refinement. This is where skill becomes instinct, and instinct becomes reliability. When practiced consistently, it allows you to navigate even the most complex and challenging arguments with ease and precision. At this point, winning every argument is no longer an effort. It becomes a natural result of how you think, speak, and engage with the world. Chapter 7. At the ultimate level, argumentation transcends technique, structure, and even strategy. It becomes a disciplined mindset that governs how you perceive disagreement itself. You are no longer focused on winning in the conventional sense. Instead, you operate with a level of clarity and control where outcomes are shaped before resistance can even form. This is not about dominating conversations. It is about mastering perception, timing, and intent so completely that conflict dissolves into alignment. The first principle at this level is perception architecture. Every argument exists within a mental framework constructed by both participants. These frameworks include beliefs, experiences, biases, and expectations. If you attempt to argue without understanding this structure, you are working blindly. But if you can identify and subtly reshape that framework, the argument becomes significantly easier to navigate. Perception architecture begins with observation. Before you respond, assess how the other person is interpreting the situation. What assumptions are they making? What outcomes are they expecting? What emotional filters are they applying? Once you identify these elements, you can begin to adjust them gradually. You are not attacking their conclusions directly. You are refining the structure that produces those conclusions. Another critical concept is intent clarity. At this level, you must be precise about your own objective. Many arguments fail because the person engaging in them does not fully understand what they want. Are you trying to change a belief, influence a decision, or simply establish understanding? Each objective requires a different approach. Without clarity of intent, your communication becomes scattered and ineffective. Intent clarity also prevents unnecessary escalation. When you know your objective, you can avoid distractions and irrelevant conflicts. You remain focused on what matters, and this focus strengthens your position. Another advanced principle is frictionless communication. The goal here is to reduce resistance to the lowest possible level. Every word, tone, and gesture should be designed to maintain flow rather than create friction. This requires precision and restraint. Avoid unnecessary complexity. Avoid emotional triggers. And avoid confrontational phrasing. Friction often arises from perceived threat. If the other person feels that their intelligence, identity, or autonomy is being challenged, they resist. To prevent this, ensure that your communication feels collaborative rather than competitive. Use language that invites discussion rather than demands agreement. Another essential skill is dynamic positioning. In earlier stages, positioning involved maintaining a reasonable and adaptable stance. At this level, positioning becomes fluid. You are not fixed in one perspective. You can shift angles, explore alternative viewpoints, and adjust your stance in real time without losing coherence. This flexibility allows you to navigate complex arguments with ease. If one approach encounters resistance, you shift to another without appearing inconsistent. This creates the impression of depth and adaptability, which enhances your credibility. Another powerful concept is controlled disclosure. You do not reveal all your arguments at once. Instead, you release information strategically based on the flow of the conversation. This maintains engagement and allows you to adjust your approach as new information emerges. Controlled disclosure also prevents overload. If you present too much information at once, the other person may become overwhelmed or disengaged. By pacing your arguments, you maintain clarity and focus. Another advanced principle is influence layering. This involves combining multiple techniques within a single interaction. For example, a single statement can include validation, reframing, and subtle redirection. This layered approach increases efficiency and impact. For instance, you might say, "I understand why that approach seems effective, and it does address part of the issue, but if we look at the long-term implications, there may be a more sustainable option." This statement acknowledges, aligns, and redirects simultaneously. Another key element is temporal awareness. Arguments unfold over time, and timing influences effectiveness. Introducing a strong point too early may create resistance. Introducing it too late may reduce its impact. You must develop sensitivity to timing, recognizing when the other person is most receptive. Temporal awareness also includes understanding when to pause, when to advance, and when to conclude. These decisions shape the overall flow of the argument. Another critical skill is resilience to unpredictability. Even with preparation, unexpected responses will occur. At this level, you remain composed regardless of surprises. Instead of reacting impulsively, you absorb the information, reassess, and respond with clarity. This adaptability ensures that you maintain control even in uncertain situations. Another advanced concept is meta-communication. This involves addressing the structure of the conversation itself. For example, if the discussion becomes unproductive, you can step back and say, "It seems we are approaching this from different angles. Let's clarify the main objective." This resets the conversation and restores structure. Meta-communication is particularly useful in complex or emotionally charged arguments. It allows you to regain control without direct confrontation. Another important principle is psychological endurance. High-level arguments can be mentally demanding. Maintaining focus, composure, and precision over extended discussions requires endurance. Develop the ability to sustain clarity without fatigue affecting your performance. Another element is ethical influence. At this level, your ability to shape perception is significant. It must be guided by integrity. Misusing these skills for manipulation or deception may yield short-term results, but it damages long-term credibility. True mastery involves aligning influence with truth and constructive outcomes. Another advanced technique is outcome framing. Instead of focusing solely on the argument itself, emphasize the consequences of different outcomes. Help the other person visualize what will happen if a particular path is chosen. This shifts the discussion from abstract debate to practical implications. Another key skill is recognizing silent agreement. Not all agreement is verbal. Changes in tone, reduced resistance, or thoughtful pauses can indicate that your argument is being accepted. Recognize these signals and adjust your approach accordingly. Pushing further at this stage can create unnecessary friction. Another concept is conversational minimalism. At this level, you say less but achieve more. Each statement is deliberate and impactful. You avoid filler, repetition, and unnecessary elaboration. This precision enhances clarity and authority. Another critical principle is internal stability. External control begins with internal control. Your thoughts, emotions, and reactions must remain stable regardless of the situation. This stability allows you to think clearly and act strategically. Another advanced element is relational awareness. Arguments do not occur in isolation. They exist within relationships. Consider the long-term impact of your communication. Preserve trust, respect, and mutual understanding. Winning at the cost of the relationship is not true success. Another skill is strategic patience. Some arguments require time to resolve. Do not force immediate outcomes. Allow ideas to develop and perspectives to evolve. Patience often leads to deeper and more lasting agreement. Another important concept is continuous refinement. Even at this level, learning does not stop. Analyze your interactions, identify patterns, and refine your approach. Mastery is not a fixed state. It is an ongoing process. Finally, understand that at this level, argumentation becomes a reflection of your overall thinking process. It is not a separate skill, but an extension of how you analyze, communicate, and interact with the world. You are no longer reacting to arguments. You are shaping them. You are not just influencing outcomes. You are influencing how those outcomes are perceived and accepted. You operate with clarity, precision, and control without needing to assert dominance. This is the final evolution. Not force, not persuasion in its obvious form, but quiet authority. The ability to guide conversations, align perspectives, and achieve outcomes with minimal resistance. When you reach this stage, you do not just win arguments. You redefine them. You transform disagreement into understanding, conflict into alignment, and conversation into a tool of deliberate and effective influence. This is the highest form of mastery.